Okay, one thing I never managed to get through my head was Hitler's so-called mass appeal. Historians always talk about his magnetic charisma, about people literally fainting in his presence, his supposedly masterful oratory skills. But all I see is some extremely weird, awkward little kind of penguin of a guy with a particular mustache. And also, anyone can go on YouTube and check out one of his speeches today and just see Hitler sweating profusely at the podium, making these grand, silly Chaplin like gestures, screaming like he's having a fit. He's not hard to parody, which is probably why Chaplin did it. I just do not get it. What am I missing here?
One of the things is these speeches that we see that are recorded are Hitler after he's come to power. These are at these mass rallies that are organized and orchestrated. The famous, most of these clips are from the Nuremberg rallies or from the Sports Palace, and you're taking him at his most fanatic moments. In some ways, it's Hitler unleashed, it's Hitler unchained. Once again, you need to back up, and this is where I wasn't. This is this issue of historic hindsight. We look and we go, "Oh, how is this possible?" There was some kind of charisma that he had in these smaller settings, even where you heard it from Albert Speer, who had been a student of architecture. He went as a student to a Hitler rally, a young man, and was just transfixed and won over. The same with Leni Riefenstahl, the
The film
filmmaker.
director, yeah.
Yeah, she was filmed. At the time, she'd been a famous actress, and Hitler had wanted to meet her just because she was a pretty young thing. He then invited her to one of his rallies, and it was the same thing. She was mesmerized and transfixed. So there was something about it. The most interesting visit, and once again, this goes back to the early Hitler. There was a psychologist named Hans Prinzhorn, and he wrote, his legacy is that he wrote the first book about the relationship between artistic expression and insanity. And it's it was a landmark book at the time. But Prinzhorn, he was a critic, he was an analyst, and he went to a Hitler rally, and ended up writing a fascinating series of articles analyzing Hitler and exactly what you said. And what was clear to him was Hitler's mastery of not so much the language, but he said the rhythm and intonation. And he said Hitler would bring something up to a peak, like almost a phonetic peak, and then stop and drop like this. And he said you could feel the pressure in the room just go down. And he said it was more an emotional response to this, and his ability to it was as much an emotional experience as it was an intellectual experience. And he said, a lot of what Hitler said was complete nonsense, but this mesmerizing quality, this ability to convey emotion and to connect with the audience. And he said he really knew how to read an audience. So, and what we're talking about is not a mass stadium with, 10 or 20,000 people in it, or the Nuremberg rally grounds. We're talking about a beer hall with a couple of hundred people in it. A crowded setting, people are packed in there, Hitler on stage, and his ability to read a crowd and manipulate it. And Prinzhorn's, and this is I found the most interesting observation, Hitler was one of these Teflon politicians, he could make the most absurd statements. He could contradict himself. It just did not touch him. And what Prinzhorn said was, the problem with Hitler's opponents is that they think that they are, when they catch Hitler on a contradiction or an inconsistency, and they go after it, they're going after the intellectual part of it. He said what they don't understand is that Hitler's connection to his his constituency is at an emotional level. And that's why they will never bring him down. I mean, it was an early analysis, but I think it was really, Prinzhorn stood back. And as you said, it wasn't the penguin-like character or this, Hitler caricature of himself practically. This was actually a man who in a smaller setting knew how to read an audience. The other thing that you also lack that you don't see in the earlier ones is how much humor there was. Hitler, believe it or not, based on these transcripts of the speeches, was a very funny man.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Can you tell us? Can you tell us a joke that he maybe told, or how funny in what way? I mean, I read a lot about Stalin, and he had a particular brand of like dark humor, and it's recorded often in his biographies. But Hitler, I never heard about that about him.
Well, what you'll see when you read the transcripts of his speeches, you'll see the word Heiterkeit. In various ways, which means sort of laughter, and heftige Heiterkeit. And then you'll see waves of laughter, and it comes up again and again. And what he tended to do was to make fun of his political opponents for the most part. I mentioned the one about, if Germany was meant to be run by aristocrats, we
right, the monocle. Yeah,
with monocle. There was a one of his main political opponents on the right wing was a man named Alfred Hugenberg, and he said, Hugenberg is nothing more than this dog that's brought out for tricks on stage to run around and then go back. And Hugenberg was kind of this guy with these big handlebar mustache. He was this portly guy. He was actually a pretty comical looking figure, so he wasn't difficult to parody. But Hitler would go after his political opponents like this, and it was sort of mean spirited type of humor. But as I say, you forget that, or not forget, we never even knew that a Hitler rally in the early days was actually a pretty funny thing. It was Hitler made a reference to Ford, because Ford was a vicious, Henry Ford, the industrialist, was a vicious anti-Semite, and Hitler actually really liked, embraced, Ford's anti-Semitism. Ford published 2 volumes of a book called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. There was a translation of that, and Hitler used to have copies of it outside of his office, translation in German that he used to give to people. But it was sort of a phrase like, Ford's politics certainly runs better than his cars do. But sort of, just, little things, but constant little jabs.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's more jabs, but
could he take a joke about himself, or was that a step too far?
I suspect not.
Okay,
I suspect not.
Makes sense.
I think Hitler took himself too seriously, and I think those around him took him too seriously. I mean, that's a really interesting question, but I can't think of anyone who survived. There were people who made comments about him that were pretty funny, but they didn't live to laugh.
Okay. Okay, you already told us what his biographer, Sir Ian Kershaw, said about Hitler and his luck of the devil. But what do you think? Was this guy actually a political mastermind? Did he see the path to power clearly all along and was playing some sort of 4D chess? Or was it just maybe a combination of some sort of low cunning that he did have and most of all luck?
I think his grand strategy was with Weimar was, as he said from the very beginning, to destroy democracy through democratic process. I don't think he had that was the grand strategy, um, but he was a political opportunist. And when the right opportunity came along, um, it was, he was able to seize it or manipulate any moment or individual to his advantage. With that said, this luck of the devil played a really big role because there were so many moments when Hitler could have or should have failed or fallen, and things just fell to his advantage. To a certain degree, this Teflon quality that Hans Prinzhorn had described, because Hitler could do things that could bring down any other politician, but somehow was able to get away with it. Can I back up for 1 second? You
Please.
mentioned the humor. As I mentioned, people making fun of him. I mean, the Hindenburg quote, first of all, of this Bohemian corporal, but also
The
the
stamps.
postage stamp story. But the cartoons making fun of Hitler are just endless, and a lot of them in the newspapers are endless, are very funny. We were talking about how Hitler appeared to be at the end. This is a cartoon from mid-January 1933, just before Hitler is 2 weeks before he's made chancellor. It shows Hitler standing in a graveyard, in a cemetery, and sort of like this. All the holding his own head, I think. Anyway, but all the headstones are broken swastika crosses, and the title underneath it is "The New Hamlet." And it was, this guy was just washed up, but they were finding the other cartoon that I love. It's from Hitler. In one occasion, was literally caught with his pants down, and it was called Hitler's underwear moment. And there are these wonderful cartoons of Hitler out there like this. So I should say he was, within his inner circle, no one was making fun of him, but there was a tremendous amount of ridicule. And this was actually in the fall of 32. And I've heard other politicians in the contemporary situation say the same thing. Hitler said, "For the last 12 years, people have been laughing at me. Nobody's laughing anymore."
Ooh.
Yeah. And this is when he went on to add, he said, "Heads will roll." So I talked earlier about Hitler's blindness to defeat, his blindness, or whatever it is, his inability to be humiliated, or his capacity to hold off humiliation. This man was subjected to so much ridicule, to so much humiliation, that you'd say for any normal human being, how could you stand it? But he was just blinded to this and kept going. And as I say, your reaction was my reaction when I saw this in one of his speeches. "You've laughed at me for the last 12 years. No one's laughing anymore." So
You actually managed to interview Hitler's last private secretary, Traudl Junge, whose memories were the basis for the famous film Der Untergang, or The Downfall, which was depicting his last days in the bunker in Berlin and has been memed to oblivion on the internet. Anyway, has anything she told you about Hitler surprised you, or perhaps has stayed in your mind?
Well, there's this term about 6 degrees of separation. Well, with Traudl Junge, I was one handshake of separation. Yeah, I did. Right before, Traudl Junge was Hitler's private secretary. There were Hitler had lunch right before he committed suicide in April of 45, and there were 4 people at the lunch table: Adolf Hitler, Eva Braun, Traudl Junge and another secretary. I connected with her because when I was working on my book on Hitler's private library, I was coming across repeated marginalia well, first of all, a large collection of books on the spiritual, on the occult, on various religious, various religions, different forms of higher powers that shape the world. And I was just curious about this because a lot of them had marginalia. And so I sought out Traudl Jung and I said to her, and was able to spend a half a day talking to her about, her experience and her time with him. But the real question was, I first of all showed her photocopies of the marginalia and also these books. And she did confirm, she said, he read a book a night and she used to have breakfast with him every morning. So he said what she remembered was him sort of holding an endless exegesis about his previous night's reading. But she said, yes, he was preoccupied by this notion of what he called Vorsehung or providence, some higher power that was guiding him. And part of this came from the fact that, this is going back to Kirchhoff's Luck of the Devil. There were at least 25 assassination attempts on Hitler, that he survived. The most famous one being in, the general's
Stauffenberg.
plot. The Stauffenberg plot, where the bomb goes off next to him. Traudl Jung remembers she was with him. She was in her room at that point. The bomb had gone off, and she remembers him knocking at her door and opening it, and his uniform was still smoldering. But he said, this is, he then later claimed that, this was proof that, he was protected by higher powers. And she said something really interesting. As I said to her, well, did he, was this just for public consumption or did he believe it? And, she said he didn't necessarily believe on a bearded God sitting on a cloud, with a protective halo over him. But she said he did believe, she said, if anything, it would have been in some kind of, in the realm of physics, and metaphysics that somehow were guiding him to a larger destiny that he believed in. That was her opinion. But then she said something very important. She says, but how can anyone know what another person actually believes or doesn't? Which to my mind, you said if there's any takeaway from it, was really, it suggested the credibility. The woman understood the man that she had been serving. And once again, a bit like the Riefenstahl, a bit like the Speer had, been drawn into this, but found herself at the absolute epicenter of this as sort of just a young woman, but had been, processing it, over the decades. As I say, for me, it was an experience sort of a, 1 degree of separation from really one of the most important moments in history.
It is a little bit, I mean, I don't know which word to use, ironic or funny, that Hitler was spiritually closer to some New Age yoga mom than to a Protestant pastor.
Well, actually, you're right. And I'll tell you what, there's some very bizarre manuscripts. He has this 300-page manuscript that was given to him. And once again, this has marginalia in it with all of this mapping about how all these different forces in the world fit together. And it really does read like sort of this New Age spiritualism, rather than, he was raised as a Roman Catholic, but certainly not sort of your traditional, I'd say, God on the cloud with the beard and the thunderbolt. So,
I interviewed Norman Ohler. He wrote the popular book Blitzed, about Hitler taking a bunch of drugs. Do you think there was something to it?
I think when you look at Hitler's actions and decision-making processes early on, I don't think they touched on the core of who he was. I think with or without drugs, Hitler was single-minded, was blinded. I mean, the Leni Riefenstahl's film, Triumph des Willens,
Yeah,
the triumph
the
of the
triumph of the
will.
will. Yeah.
And I think, Hitler, when you listen to his own astonishment in his speech of saying we started out with 7 people, and there's never been anything like this in German political history, and there really hadn't been. Just an astonishing success story, and he went from one to the other. So I think drugs maybe played a marginal role, but I think with or without drugs, the Hitler that we saw straight through to the end was the same. And I think, my conversations with Traudo Jung about Hitler in those last bits was just a man who was incredibly depressed, was in despair, was enraged at. He felt that it was the failure of people around him that led to what happened. So the medication was there and may have had some influence, but with or without, I think the course of action that we saw was pretty much, the man that we have come to know. And with that said, I think the film Der Untergang, Downfall, with Bruno Ganz playing Hitler, I think captured who he was in those final days, those final weeks, as perfectly as it's ever going to be captured.
Hey, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. This podcast has no sponsors, no production team, and no editors. It's just little old me. And as such, I'm at the mercy of you lovely folks watching and listening. So please do subscribe on YouTube. Click that little bell thing. Follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, I don't want to sell you an ugly t-shirt that you don't really need. So if you can, and most of all, if you want, please support me on Patreon. And at this point, I have to express my eternal gratitude to my patrons on Patreon, aka the producers of this show. As always, without you comrades, this podcast simply wouldn't exist. So a massive thank you to Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaž, Štrole, Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordon, Lorenzo, Jurečuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Taichi. You guys are the best.